begins her meeting.
So I think that's my cue. Okay. Thanks everybody for joining in tonight, and thanks to the folks from MPS who are facilitating this for us. I think there's lots of things I could talk about tonight about the land use bylaw, but we're going to get into a lot of the details as we go through the presentation later. But I wanted to just maybe step back a bit and sort of talk a little bit about why are we changing our land use bylaw right now. And it's kind of a long story, actually. When I joined council about 8 years ago, I came in midterm for the existing councillors that were Kathy Boschma and James Coghill. And when they were, after I joined council, early in their tenure, they had received a lot of questions, comments around the land use bylaw. And that was having to do with, developments that had occurred, developments that maybe were rumored to be occurring. And there was a lot of uncertainty around the bylaw. The current land use bylaw was crafted in the mid-90s. It's been amended a few times in the interim, but the guts of it were put in place almost 30 years ago. And so 8 years ago, when the then council was looking at this, we felt it was time to look at the bylaw and correct some and clarify some of these things that were troubling our residents. So that was started. The discussion about amending or replacing the bylaw started about 8 years ago. So why did it take 8 years to get here? Well, a lot, as I like to say, stuff happens, and a lot of stuff happened in the 8 years. We've had change in councillors. Our current council, of course, myself, John McIver and Tim Kirby. So they've been around for, I think they've both been around for at least 5 years, and they've been part of the conversation since they've joined council, and they've brought new perspectives and their own insights into some of the questions that we had around the existing bylaw, and that's been very valuable. We've had changes in our chief administrative officer. When I joined council, George Jones was the chief administrative officer, and almost quasi-volunteer role. George stepped away from that, and we had Dwight Moskalik for a number of years. But now, luckily, and I'm touching wood here, that we have Emily House, who's our current chief administrative officer. And not to take away from George or Dwight, but I continue to say we're very lucky to have Emily. She brings to our village a breadth and depth about municipal governments and municipal governance that's been very helpful to council and has been helpful in this project as well. So we want to do all we can to make sure Emily doesn't go away. So we've tried to indenture her, but she's so far she says she's happy with us. Another thing that happened about 5 or 6 years ago, the previous council, if I can refer to that, we sent out a questionnaire to villagers. It had some broad sort of concept questions about a potential change to the land use bylaw. We received that feedback, we reviewed it, and although we haven't really acted on it in detail up until now, that has been an important input into this process as well. The other thing that happened in the last 8 years is we had a new Municipal Government Act, and that act changed a lot of things for us as a summer village. It put in many new requirements on us that weren't codified previously. So we had things like we had to enhance our emergency planning. That ended up having a knock-on effect. We had to renegotiate our fire services agreement with Parkland County. It introduced things like intermunicipal collaboration agreements with your neighboring municipalities. So we had to spend some time with that. Also had a requirement to create a municipal development plan. We've gone through a similar process that we're doing now with the land use bylaw. We went through that just over the previous 2-ish years to put that in place. So there was a lot of things under the Municipal Government Act that, again, being a small organization, we can't do everything at once. We had to prioritize as a council, and we had to work through those new requirements as a council and as a Summer Village. I would point out that this proposed land use bylaw is entirely consistent with our municipal development plan. And the new land use bylaw that we'll talk about earlier or a little later in this conversation also has a number of things on a process related area that weren't required under the previous Municipal Government Act. So those have been incorporated into this draft as well. The last thing I think that's not just happened in the last 8 years, but I think has happened over probably the last 2 decades, there's more awareness about environmental impacts, lake health, and as stewards for the village and as a community that is on Lake Wabamun, those things need to be recognized in our land use bylaw. And a lot of the things that are in this proposed new land use bylaw reflect that. Things like having require good drainage down to the lake. There's sensitivity around the riparian areas and all sorts of things. So those things are important and need to be addressed, and they are addressed in this proposed bylaw right now. So even though it's taken us 8 years from the early days about thinking about changing our land use bylaw, I think we've learned a lot as a result of all the things I just enumerated, as well as ongoing discussions with villagers. So I think even though it took us a long time, I think we're coming forward with a better land use bylaw than we might have had we put some band-aids on 8 years ago to address some of the hot spots. So we've got a more fulsome proposal before us. The last thing I want to touch on is, and there'll be a lot of discussion tonight about changes to the land use bylaw, but there are some foundational pieces in the existing land use bylaw that have not been changed that I think are very important for us to all understand. The first one I'll touch on is that we are a summer village on the east shore of Lake Wabamun, and since the mid-50s under our plot plan, we have 47 residential properties in our summer village. And we're not changing that. That's the way it's going to stay. There's not going to be any major businesses allowed within our village. We are adding some clarification around things like work from home and potential rental or bed and breakfast, but we'll get into those details later. But we're going to continue to be a summer village that is residential in nature, will not have major commercial impacts within the village, and there will be no subdivision of these 47 lots. There is some provisions in this that will allow for some potential subdivision only to deal with corrections of property lines if any of those exist. But that's really why that's there. We're not envisioning increasing population density as a result of this bylaw. We're sticking with our 47 lots. We do have a few property owners that own multiple lots. They will have the flexibility and continue to have the flexibility to deal with those each as individual lots or as a single property as their discretion within the parameters of the land use bylaw. But we're maintaining that fundamental tenet of our village. The other important thing is that within our village boundaries, we've got a fair bit of properties that are designated as natural reserve. And council's intent is to maintain those natural reserves as green space and available for low impact recreational use. But there is no intention at all in this land use bylaw to open up those properties for either development or commercial or more residential. We need to maintain, or we're proposing to maintain the way we are today in this bylaw. And I think those sometimes get lost in the detail of all the other things in a land use bylaw, but I think I wanted to highlight those for our listeners tonight. So, you know, while our current bylaw has served us very well for 30-ish years, it is in need of a refresh. And that's, you know, this council has carefully considered all the things I've talked about as already. And we're trying to position us for hopefully the next 30 years, so we don't have to go through this exercise too often. So today is one of your chances as villagers for questions about the proposal, provide feedback, etc. This is not the last chance to do that. There will be another opportunity there will be a public hearing with the draft bylaw once it's gone through first reading by council. And I think Jane and team will talk a little bit more about the process in their presentation. But this is a chance for you to learn more about it. And you can always talk to councillors outside this forum as we go through this process. The last thing I wanted to highlight is one of the things Emily has been very successful at for our village is looking at opportunities for grant funding. And Emily has been able to arrange grant funding with a number of other communities that are going through a similar process. So a lot of our costs associated with this review and redraft will be covered by new grant funds. So thank you to Emily for that. But that also allows us the opportunity to engage Jane and her team, who have a lot of experience and expertise and can bring a broader view of what's going on in the broader municipal community, so that we can build those things, the best parts of those things, into our draft bylaw. So thanks to everybody for participating tonight, and appreciate your taking the time and showing the interest. I think this is an important project for our village. And with that, I'll turn it back to Brad and Jane and team to lead us through the rest of the evening. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim. I'll start my video just for a second so that I can introduce myself, and then when I get into the presentation as we go through the, unfortunately, about 40 slides, I'll try to go through the ones that are procedural or process ones as quickly as I can, and spend a little bit more time with you on the ones that were changes that we discussed a lot with council, that were the stickier ones that I think it's important that we flag and have a little bit more in-depth of a presentation or discussion over. So this evening, what I would like to do with you is go through what a land use bylaw is, what the process has been. Tim provided some of that information, so I'll go over that a little bit lightly. And then I would like to take you through some of the more substantive changes to the land use bylaw. In going through this process with council and administration, we've had a number of meetings, and there's been a number of different versions of the draft document. Your council's put in a lot of time and a lot of hours to make sure that as we go through this process, this land use bylaw is appropriate for your community and addresses your unique needs. And as a result, you know, in the last, reviewing the last version of the land use bylaw, I think it probably was 3 or 4 meetings of 3 or 4 hours. So I'm not going to put you all through that. We're just going to focus on the highlights. But I'll say right from the beginning that because I don't have that much time with you, it's very, very important that you have a look at the land use bylaw and read through the land use bylaw, because this document is quite quite a different land use bylaw than the one your community currently has adopted. So there may be some changes to the document that we don't have the opportunity to go over with you tonight. That doesn't mean they're not important changes, but I'd like to encourage you to undertake your own review as well. And once we are through the meeting this evening, if you have any questions, or once you've had the opportunity after this meeting to review the document, if you have some questions, to reach out to us, and we will we'd be happy to answer any questions that you have and provide you with any clarification to help you determine whether or not the document is appropriate for you, or if, in your opinion, additional changes need to be made. So turn my video off here and I'll get into it. So my name's Jane, and James will be with us for the rest of the evening too. Brad will be with us for a little while, and then he has to jump out to another meeting this evening. The gentlemen, Brad and James, both indicated that the best way to ask questions as we go through would be to send them messages in the chat. You can message me too, but if I'm talking, I may not see it. So I'd encourage you to send a message to James or Brad, and if they can answer it, they will. If it's something that they think is a really, really, really good question, and other people in our audience tonight might have a similar question, they might save it to the end or bring it up at the end so that we can make it part of the record and share that information with everybody in the group. We will keep a record of all of the questions that we received tonight. So if you did ask a question and we didn't talk about it over the course of the meeting, even if you did get an answer in the chat, we'll be putting together what we heard report at the end of the engagement part of this process, and all of those questions and the answers provided will be included in that, so that everybody in the community has the opportunity to share in the knowledge, I guess, that was exchanged during this part of the process. So our company, Municipal Planning Services, we're a municipal planning consulting firm based out of Edmonton. We're a small firm. We have, I always have to do a head count when we do this, 6-7 planners in our office, and we work exclusively with rural municipalities, towns, villages, and summer villages. We've done a little bit of work for watershed associations and the province as well, but we work on the municipal government side of land use and community planning. We do long range and short range planning. So the long range planning would be things like the municipal development plan project that your summer village undertook a couple years back, land use bylaws, intermunicipal development plans, watershed management plans, those sorts of things. And then we also are involved in helping communities prepare their land use bylaws. Part of our day-to-day operation also includes processing subdivision applications for some of our clients and assisting some of our smaller clients who don't have an in-house planner or development officer process some of their development permit applications. For your municipality, we would be the subdivision authority in the event that a subdivision application came through for, say, a boundary adjustment or something like that to deal with a property with an encroachment issue. You have your own development officer, so Tony helps with that part of the current planning process, but we're available if any of your administration have any questions and just need a second opinion. So we've been working with Emily and with the Summer Village for a number of years now. Don't know your community nearly as well as you do, but we've had lots of wonderful conversations with your council and administration who've been very willing to share with us and help us learn about you as we go through this work. So we know, and we want to acknowledge, I guess, that there is really no good night to have a meeting. All of you are likely pulled in 6 different directions at any given time, either with family considerations or work considerations, or knowing that you are at the lake. And it's not the most beautiful of nights, but it's not the worst night either. Other things pulling at you. So we really appreciate you taking the time to participate in this project and to be here with us to learn a little bit more about the land use bylaw. The purpose of this project, as directed by council and administration, has been to make sure that your land use bylaw incorporates and has been revised to reflect the changes to the provincial legislation that have been enacted over the last few years. There is a new Municipal Government Act, and it has been subsequently amended a couple of times even since the new act was adopted. Additionally, there's some new regulations that were brought into place to support the Municipal Government Act that have some changes to some of the procedural aspects of land management, land development in municipalities. So those were some of the key bits that we were looking at as we were going through this process. We were also reviewing the land use bylaw to make sure that it aligns with the Summer Village's new municipal development plan and incorporates directions specifically from council and feedback from the community. So that includes things like reviewing the response from the survey that was undertaken by council and administration before we became involved in the project. It was important, and I think it's important to your council and administration and also to our office in working with lake communities to make sure that the land use bylaw incorporates development regulations and design mitigations that support watershed management best practices and watershed management planning where it's appropriate to do so. And what I mean by appropriate to do so is that, you know, there is sort of this is what we would do if we were in an environment that had not previously been developed. This is what we would do moving forward, knowing what we know now. But when we're working with communities that are already developed, we have to look at what the best practice is and then what's possible and come up with a solution for the community that enables people to use and enjoy their properties as they're subdivided and developed today, and then still looks at and provides guidance that will help mitigate development in the future as properties redevelop. So it's a bit of a negotiation to try and figure out what we can do to make things work within an existing older community such as your community. We looked for redundancies within the existing land use bylaw or conflicts to try and ensure that the new document will be as easy as a land use bylaw can be to read, because it is a bit of a challenging document to get through. And we tried to add some diagrams and provide some clarity in the language to make it a little bit easier to interpret the provisions in the document and make it easier for your administration to be able to consistently apply. One of the things that I think results in the most frustration within communities when people are doing development is when it's unclear what the ask or the request is in terms of application requirements, or when there is concern about whether or not what the requirements are at time of development are being applied consistently. So the more clarification, the better the definitions, the clearer the language in the land use bylaw, the easier it is to more consistently and appropriately and accurately interpret. So we spent a lot of time working with council to try and address some of those things. It was important not to over-regulate your community, but make sure that the regulations and the definitions and the language in the document were clear enough that they could be consistently and clearly interpreted. So our objectives for tonight are just to provide you with an overview of the project in the draft document, and then to make sure that you're aware of your future opportunities to provide us with your feedback. We do assume when we have these meetings that likely many of you will not have had the opportunity to go through the entire document. So this is our opportunity to help you as you are undertaking your own review to, I guess, guide your review and identify for you areas where we think it's quite important that you look at in greater detail. So we won't put you in the hot seat tonight. So what is a land use bylaw? So it is a bylaw that's required for all municipalities in the province. Every municipality has to have one. Even the teeny tiny little Summer Village of Point Allison has a land use bylaw. I think their permanent population is under 10. So yeah, it's a document that regulates land use and development within a municipality, and it applies to all of the land within the municipality. It establishes processes for development and subdivision applications, for notification, enforcement, and appeals. And then it also provides information about how the document can be amended, how notices are provided. And sometimes they include a little bit of information about the fees process. Land use bylaws establish regulations for specific land use classes. So those will be the things that are your permitted and discretionary uses. And then they provide regulations that would generally apply to any type of development that were to occur within a municipality. So that would be things like considerations like parking or landscaping or lot grading, those sorts of things. You have a municipal development plan, which is your visioning document. It's sort of like the, I don't know, the IKEA catalog or a dream book or something like that. And through that process, we worked with council and administration to identify and have an understanding of what your community would like to see happen in the future. The land use bylaw works with the MDP as a kind of instruction manual. So it should establish the rules and the roadmap for how to achieve the vision that's set out in the municipal development plan. So Tim mentioned that your land use bylaw is a little bit old. It is. The current land use bylaw, bylaw 242, which I believe was most recently adopted in 2012, but it sounds like it was not substantially amended from the version that it replaced. So it is an older document. Land use bylaws are generally looked at every 10 years. They should be, and I say they should be because many summer villages don't look at them as often. And really for the summer villages, unless you're having problems with them or there have been as substantial set of legislative changes as have occurred, in our case in the last little while, they can go a little bit longer than that. Your current land use bylaw doesn't address the recent changes to legislation that affect the development permit process, the subdivision process, notification, the appeal process, and a couple of other things that are pretty pertinent to how municipalities manage land and development. So it was really important that those changes be made to make it a little bit easier for you in the community to understand what happens if you apply for a development permit application through your municipality. Even though the land use bylaw is out of date right now, which is the case that I think many of the summer villages around the lake are in right now, in fact, all of them, it is the rules that apply for how the development permit process, subdivision process, appeal process that are established in the Municipal Government Act. Those are the rules that the municipality has to follow. So it's not clear right now for you, because unless you go to the Municipal Government Act, it may appear that what the municipality is doing when it's processing or administering land management, land development within your municipality doesn't appear consistent with the language in your land use bylaw, and that's because they have to. They're governed by the legislation. So this will fix that and make sure that the requirements in the legislation are more clearly identified and correctly identified within your land use bylaw. Additionally, one of the things we needed to do too was just make sure there was better alignment, right? That there was actual alignment between the land use bylaw and your new MDP. The Summer Village didn't have a municipal development plan prior to the adoption of your new MDP, so there wasn't those considerations in the last time the land use bylaw had been developed. So one of the things that a land use bylaw does is it divides a municipality into different districts. Now, the city of Edmonton in their land use bylaw, they talk about them as zones. So that might be the term that you're more familiar with. Sometimes it's called the zoning bylaw. In the Municipal Government Act, it's referred to as a land use bylaw. And the language is districts, but in Alberta, district and zone seem to be used interchangeably, even though that's American language. So if I use district or zone, I'm talking about the same thing. Within each of those districts, the land use bylaw will identify different types of land classes or land uses that are identified as permitted or discretionary within each of those districts. There's a pretty significant difference between a permitted and a discretionary use. A permitted use is allowed almost by right, as long as the site is suitable for the use which is intended, and what's being proposed is consistent with the other requirements in the land use bylaw that affect that use. Then it needs to be approved. It has to be approved by the development officer. If it's a discretionary use, it's identified as a discretionary use in the district, then it may or may not be approved. In most instances, the discretionary uses are also approved. And in a community like yours, where we have such a very limited number of land uses, we're not terribly concerned about conflicts between land uses on different lots. You guys have residential development, and then you have some community public space, and that's it. So when we're looking at which uses should be identified as discretionary, really we're thinking about what types of things could be proposed in the community that we may have concerns with in regards to how the land or the physical characteristics of the land are within the municipality, or how big are the lots, or are there some lots that perhaps some of the things would be too small for and may negatively impact adjacent landowners. So we do still have permitted and discretionary uses, but the range of uses isn't as broad as it would be in a bigger community that had commercial and industrial uses, which you won't have. As I mentioned, there is a relationship between this document and the municipal development plan. The municipal development plan provides that long-term vision for land use and development, and the land use bylaw is intended to implement the municipal development plan. So when we are looking at the map for the land use bylaw, it is really consistent with the future land use map, the future land use map in the MDP. In the MDP, the use classes are a little bit broader than they are in the land use bylaw. In the land use bylaw, you'll note as we go through that there are 2 different residential districts. In the MDP, we've just identified a future residential area. So where the preferred locations would be for residential development within your community on a going forward basis. And then in the land use bylaw, we refine that a little bit to identify appropriate land uses and districts and building setback requirements based on the characteristics of those existing lots, because you guys have some very, very unique lots as a result of the embankment. And then on the north end of the lake, the lot characteristics they're a lot less deep, and they are a lot closer to the water. So there's different considerations. In terms of process, there was the survey that was undertaken in 2016 when council was working on the beginnings of the land use bylaw review. That was shared with us, and we had a conversation with council and administration about what they had been working on, what the community had shared with them at that time, as what some of the concerns were with the existing document. We identified areas where from our, I guess, professional practice, we had noticed deficiencies with the document, either based on those legislative changes or just from the perspective of administering the document in an effective way. And we discussed those with council and administration. They gave us their feedback and guidance and direction that helped us prepare the first draft of the land use bylaw. So once we had the first draft of the land use bylaw, we had our series of long meetings with council, who really spent a lot of time and put a lot of care into that first review of the draft of the document, and gave us some excellent feedback that resulted in a number of substantive changes to the document. That is the document, I guess, on the Summer Village's website that we're sharing with you tonight as well. So once council was in a position where they were mostly comfortable, I think, with the draft document, comfortable enough for us to release it to you, the community, for your input, it was shared with you, and they gave us the okay to set up this meeting so that we could present the document to you to help you with your further review. As I mentioned earlier, when you have had the opportunity to review the document and provide us with some comments and ask some questions, we'll compile all of that information into a what we heard report that we'll share with council, and then council will provide us with some additional direction, resulting in some likely additional changes to the document to make sure that it's appropriate for your community. When those changes have been incorporated into the document, we will prepare an updated version that will also be posted on the Summer Village's website for you to access, and through administration, we'll schedule first reading of the bylaw to approve the document. Normally, the process for your municipality is that the bylaw gets put on the table. It goes to council for first reading. A public hearing is scheduled. Notice is provided to the entire community of the public hearing, and you're invited to attend and provide your testimony to council. And that's a little bit more formal a process than this process, which will be recorded. Council will carefully consider the feedback that they are provided at that time, and then they may direct our office to make further changes to the document resulting from that feedback. We will make changes as directed by council, and then get the document back to council for consideration of second and third reading. Ultimately, because it's a bylaw, it's up to council to approve it. It's a governance matter. So any support that administration and our office provides is purely like an administrative function. The decision makers for this type of a very important document are entirely council. There's a note in the chat here I just read that says, is there a briefing presentation that identifies key aspects of the changes to the provincial legislation that impacted the village? You know, there is, Robert, it's probably on the Municipal Affairs website. Maybe, James, if you're not entertaining other comments right now, do you think you could have a hunt for that and share that with Robert Jones? Maybe share it with everybody in the chat. They did at one point provide an overview, but it was a couple years ago, but I bet we can hunt that down for you. So what were some of the considerations in that first draft that was prepared? So we looked at council's previous drafts and the survey results and incorporated what we could there. We reviewed other bylaws of the Summer Village to see whether or not there were conflicts between the definitions and the wording in those bylaws or the regulations and requirements in those other bylaws and what was in the land use bylaw, and we corrected those conflicts. We reviewed the MDP to make sure that what was being proposed supported the goals and objectives and policies in the MDP, and then we reviewed the legislative requirements. The other things we looked at were how could we improve the readability of the document, and whether or not there were just internal conflicts within the document. So things like measurements that hadn't been converted properly, or terminology that was used inconsistently through the document or used and not defined. And honestly, that's one of the hardest things with these land use bylaws, because this is, I think, about 80 pages of bylaw. And we've been making changes over the last couple of years to it. And so once we were getting the document ready for consideration of first reading, we'll have to do another sweep for that. In preparing for this presentation, I noticed a couple of areas where there's still some inconsistencies in the terminology that we'll have to correct, or areas where we've used a term that we haven't defined. So it is a document that is not in its final form yet. There are changes that we know need to be made to it to just improve consistency and readability and address any conflicts or editing errors. But I think there will be some other more substantive changes, perhaps resulting from your review too. In terms of the structure of the document, the current land use bylaw, the one that will be in effect until the new land use bylaw is adopted, it has 5 sections. I like to break a land use bylaw into more sections, so it's a little bit easier to find what you're looking for in the document. So we did tease some of those sections apart, and then we did add substantially more information about just the administrative function of what happens when you are going through the development process or the subdivision process or the appeal process, or even an enforcement situation, so that information is available to you, because we do appreciate that most people won't go directly to the legislation for some of this information. And most land use bylaws, even for smaller communities like a Summer Village, they have the ability to put their own twist on some aspects of these procedural requirements to make them appropriate for their community. For example, how you provide notice of a development permit approval. There are some things you have to do, but there's some things that the municipality can choose to do or not to do. And those things really should be refined and provided in the land use bylaw and be specific to the municipality that adopts the land use bylaw. And yours has those things. So it's got more sections than it had before. It does have more information up front that relates to the administrative function. And then it additionally has more regulations that provide, I think, greater clarity about how land is to be developed or redeveloped in your case within your municipality. So now I'm going to walk you through it. From the beginning. We're not going to go through all of the sections because I don't have that much time with you tonight, and I don't know that you would appreciate that much time with me tonight, but I want to take you through the sections that are most substantially changed and areas where we perhaps had more of the longer, more challenging conversations with council. The user guide wasn't one of them. That was easy. That was an easy one. We just added at the beginning of the document a one-pager guide that provides sort of the Coles Notes version to how you should use a land use bylaw. They are long, which makes them a bit complicated. They have words or vocabulary within them that is specific to land use bylaw language. So terms are used in land use bylaws in ways that are different than in common usage. And that's sometimes a little bit frustrating, I think, for people. So we've tried to clarify how important the definitions or interpretation section of the document is, and then just make sure that you're aware that when you're doing a development in the municipality and you're looking at the land use bylaw, often you have to look at more than one section of the document to figure out how the development is being regulated and what your steps and process need to be. The end part of that one page is just encouraging you to reach out to administration if you have any questions. They do work with land use bylaws. Our office works with land use bylaws every day, so we're very familiar with them. And we're here to help and support you as much as we can through these things to try and make the process a little bit smoother and easier for you. So the next part of the document, the introduction part of the bylaw, provides information about the scope and the purpose of the bylaw. This is new. It isn't changed or altered. It just wasn't stated in your previous bylaw, so we've updated that. The section also includes some changes that reflect changes that are different in terms of wording than what's in the existing land use bylaw. For improving the readability, others have been made in order to ensure compliance with the new Municipal Government Act. And then we have incorporated some language that provides some clarification about the different things that were taken into consideration with this version of the land use bylaw that were not impacting the direction in your existing land use bylaw. So things like the municipal development plan and also the 2020 watershed management plan for the lake. So those were things that did impact the direction in this document. The interpretation section is a really important part of any land use bylaw. That's the definition section for the most part. One of the reasons that the length of the land use bylaw has expanded is because there are many more terms that are defined. Sometimes people feel like, when the community is smaller, that means that the land use bylaw doesn't need to be as sophisticated. It doesn't need to be as long. I also get people that are really surprised by how long a Summer Village land use bylaw is. And I guess a response always to that is that it still needs to be defensible, right? It still needs to be easy to interpret. It needs to be clear, and it needs to be a defensible bylaw. And in order to do that, we need to make sure that the terminology used in the document is clear and those definitions are there. So your existing land use bylaw has around 67 definitions. The draft land use bylaw has in the range of 227. And as I was getting ready for tonight, I noticed one that was still missing that we'll need to add to just ensure that if you're trying to figure out what we mean when we use one of these very specific terms in the document, there's a place to go to find that reference. Many of the new definitions that were added to the document relate to environmental terms. Some of them are technical terms that relate to different requirements that could be triggered at time of application if a site exhibits specific characteristics, like it's adjacent to a steep slope, which would be a slope steeper than 15%, or it has high water table concerns. So that we may, in those situations, need to ask for a geotechnical report if a new cottage or house is being proposed. And we wanted to provide a definition of what that meant, what a geotechnical report was from the context of this land use bylaw. And then we wanted to ensure that the development and site terms that were used in the document, so when we're identifying different setbacks or there's language about different property lines, those terms were also defined in the document and then used consistently throughout the document. Planners and development officers are, I think, pretty notorious for using different words interchangeably to mean the same thing, which is really rotten of us. Lot, parcel, that's one example. There's some other ones that are very similar to that we'll use one definition, and then throughout the document we'll use a different term to mean the same thing. So we have to go through the documents after and try and correct our error there so that it's a little bit easier for you going through. And we will have to do that another time, I'm sure, before we get to the end of this. The next section just provides a little bit of clarification about the roles and responsibilities of the different authorities related to different types of decisions about land use and development within a municipality. And that's just to provide some clarification, because sometimes a development will be proposed and someone will want to go to talk to council. And council is responsible for approving the land use bylaw, that governance function, that really important governance function, but they are not the development authority and they are not the appeal board. So once the land use bylaw is approved, the administering of the land use bylaw, so the carrying out of the direction, that has been decided by council, that falls to the shoulders of the development authority or the subdivision authority. And in the case of an appeal, so if a decision is issued that somebody does not support or does not like, then the only folks who can consider an alternate decision would be the Subdivision and Development Appeal Board or the Land and Property Rights Tribunal, which are another appeal board that I'll talk about as we go through. So this is just trying to provide clarification about who is responsible for what parts of the process in relation to land use and development within the municipality. Council approves the bylaw. They're the only ones who can give consideration to and approve or refuse amendments to the bylaw. But the administering of the development process, that's entirely the responsibility of your development officer. Subdivision authority would be whoever's appointed as the subdivision authority. And then again, if there's an appeal of a decision that's issued, then it has to go to the appropriate appeal board. An appeal can't be heard by council. In terms of amendments, land use bylaws are living documents. They are amended from time to time. The amendments can be initiated by council, who identifies something that's just not working for the community, or administration for the same reasons, or they can be initiated by a member of the community who would like to do something that is inconsistent with what's allowed in the land use bylaw. Once an amendment process has been initiated, we have to go through all of the steps of that process. So this section of the document has been expanded in order to provide a bit more information about what the requirements are to initiate an amendment and what the process is that the municipality would go through. The next section deals with the development process. It has also been substantially updated to provide more information about what the process is. We did do a review of the list of developments that do not require a development permit. The easiest way to remember or talk about this, I guess, is that if what you want to do is not identified in the section of the land use bylaw that says development not requiring a permit, then you need a development permit for it. And if you're not sure, call Emily or call Tony for clarification. But that's if you do want to do a quick check that list. It's really clear. It's called development not requiring a permit. And if what you want to do isn't identified there, then chances are you need a permit. One of the things we've noticed in particular over the last year is that I think it is perhaps not clear enough in the information municipalities provide on their web pages or in their communication to their residents that development includes not only building or construction, but also the way land and buildings are used. So if you change the way that your property is being used, you may need a development permit, even if what you're doing doesn't involve the construction of a new building or renovations to a new building. The example that's come up a fair bit over the last year has been Airbnbs. We call them tourist homes or tourist accommodations. You can't take a cottage or a house and turn it into an Airbnb without approval from the municipality. That is a significant change of use, and it requires permits. And they are either regulated in a municipality's land use bylaw or they're not. And if they're not regulated, it means they're not allowed. So that's something that we've seen pop up over the last couple of years as something that there's been a fair bit of misunderstanding about. Development is not just building, it is also how we use land and buildings within a municipality. So we've expanded the list of developments that don't require a permit to try and address some of the things that I think had been perhaps an oversight, or we'd missed them before, or they weren't things that we were dealing with before, or we needed to provide additional clarification about because we had more regulations about other things and we needed to provide that clarity. We've also revised and identified some additional information requirements that could be triggered as necessary to accompany a development permit application. We've reviewed and provided additional information about what the notification process is when a development permit, when a decision is issued for development permit, and we've updated the timelines associated with the decision process. We provided additional information about what types of conditions could be applied to a development permit decision, and then provided some additional information about, when a permit is considered valid and what can be varied in the land use bylaw and what can't. So I think if I was going to flag something for you in this section, I would recommend that you have a look at the list of developments that are not required to have a permit, just to make sure that you are familiar with that. And then I would also recommend that you have a look at the variance powers provisions in section 5 or part 5, because there are some changes in that section as well that you should be aware of. Section 6 deals with subdivision. Tim mentioned that this section hasn't been included in order to open the door to subdivision. We included this section because there's a requirement in the legislation now for a municipality to identify in their land use bylaw specifically how they will provide notice of whether or not an application for subdivision has been deemed complete within 20 days of receiving the subdivision application. So we had to speak to subdivision in some regard in the land use bylaw because this is a required component of a land use bylaw. And in doing that and revisiting that, we figured it didn't really make sense to have all sorts of information about the development process and no information about the subdivision process. So we've added some of the application requirements and process provisions to the land use bylaw too that would apply at time of subdivision, with the understanding that and the acknowledgement that the only type of subdivision that your municipality allows would be a subdivision to adjust the boundary of existing lots to deal with a property encroachment or something like that. The next section deals with appeals, and this section had to be substantially updated as well as a result of the changes to the legislation. In the more recent amendments to the Municipal Government Act, one of the changes that was made related specifically to development permit and subdivision approval appeals. It used to be that subdivision appeals could be appealed to the local subdivision and development appeal board, or what was called the Municipal Government Board. It is now called the Land and Property Rights Tribunal. There were triggers for when an appeal would be heard by the local board and when it would be heard by the province, by the now LPRT. However, when it came to development permit appeals, all development permit appeals were only appealed to the local subdivision and development appeal board. There were no municipal development permit appeals heard by the province, by the Land and Property Rights Tribunal. With the changes to the legislation, there are some triggers identified that would result in a development permit appeal now being heard by the Land and Property Rights Tribunal rather than the Subdivision and Development Appeal Board of the municipality. So we had to update that section of the document to identify that change, which is significant, and provide some information about the triggers that would identify which appeal board would hear an appeal for a permit. The last bit of the bylaw that deals with the administrative function of land use and development in a municipality is the enforcement section. And this section was updated to clarify what types of enforcement options are available to the Summer Village. And the enforcement options, so if someone builds something without approval or builds something that they can't build within the municipality because of what's in the bylaw, those enforcement options are the same in all municipalities. Normally, the types of actions that a municipality can take, doesn't matter if you're a Summer Village or you're the city of Edmonton or city of Calgary, you have the ability to issue warnings. In a small place, often you'll get a call saying, hey, it's come to our attention that, give us some more information, please. This is what you need to do to correct. If action isn't taken, a warning letter is issued. Some municipalities will issue municipal tags, which are a little fine. Municipalities that have a peace officer also have the ability to issue violation tickets that are enforceable or can be upheld by the courts. And then the last, I guess, option that is available to municipalities to force compliance is stop orders, which have to be enforced through the courts if corrective action has to be undertaken by the municipality if it's not taken by the landowner. But these are the processes that are available for dealing with enforcement, and your municipality, the Summer Village, has the same options available as any other municipality in the province. So this was just updating that, trying to make it a little bit clearer and providing some additional detail. All right. Parts 1 through 8 of the land use bylaw are really, really boring. This part, if you only have a limited amount of time, I would really recommend you to focus on Part 9 and the districts, because this is the nitty gritty regulatory stuff that impacts what you can and cannot do on your property. And there's a number of changes in these sections too, in part because we're providing more clarification about the development process within the municipality, and in part because there's some things that, you know, we're seeing people want to do on their properties that we weren't seeing 10 years ago. And so it was time to start providing some additional regulations in the bylaw to address, so that if there became a problem on a property as a result of these types of developments, the municipality had the ability to take enforcement action. The enforcement process is really long and drawn out, and often it's unfortunately expensive for the municipality who has to go through that process. And that's the case for all municipalities too. So one of the things that we try to do when we're working with land use bylaws is just make sure that there's enough direction to deal with the types of things that if we don't provide direction about, we know in our experience working with these documents can create conflicts between neighbors, or result in additional costs for the municipality. That often they're unintentional costs, but they do end up costing all of you money. And then with summer villages in particular, one of the things that we look at that we don't look at in as much depth in a town or in some parts of rural municipalities is how the development can be designed to minimize negative impacts on the lake. And that's because, you know, for the most part, those of you that are here for a couple of different reasons, but one of those reasons, one of the most important reasons, is the lake. And your use and enjoyment of your property is directly associated with the health of the lake. So anything that we can do at time of development planning and through the development approval process to ensure that new development that occurs or redevelopment that occurs within your municipality is minimizing potential negative impacts in the lake is going to protect your use and enjoyment of the lake and also protect your property value. So there's a bit that's your happiness, and there's a bit that relates to protecting your investment too in your property. So these were definite important considerations as we went through this process, and the changes in this section are designed specifically to reflect that focus. So I'm not going to go through all of those because there are too many, but I do want to highlight for you the more substantial changes and have the disclaimer again that it's really important that you look at all of these pieces. Before I go too far into them, because you will notice as we go through this, that there are some changes to the development process or the development footprint on a lot that are being proposed in this bylaw that'll be very different than what has been in place in the past. And so I want to flag for your attention that when this bylaw comes into effect, in whatever its, you know, its end ultimate form is, if what is in the land use bylaw is different than what was in the bylaw that was in effect when the development on your property was approved and constructed, you will not be forced to make changes to your property as a result of the new stuff in the document. The only time you will be directly impacted by the changes to the land use bylaw will be when you go to redevelop your property. So for example, we're in the accessory buildings provisions here. We have identified in this section new requirements for accessory buildings that are intended to result in most of the accessory buildings on a lot being placed on the road side of the property, with a couple of exceptions. And I'll talk about that in a second. So there are definitely within your municipality structures in the lakefront lot that have been there for many, many, many years, some of them. Some of those structures moving forward, if they were entirely removed, would not be allowed to be replaced once this is approved. But if they're there and there's no change, then changes to the land use bylaw won't trigger you to have to take action and make changes on your property. You're good. If you have approvals already, you're good. So it is only triggered by redevelopment. So I think that's really important to note. All right, so In this figure here and in these provisions, so this provides an overview of the changes to this section, we've identified a maximum height for accessory buildings of 9 meters. Side yard setbacks are 1.4 meters. The rear yard setback is 1.2 meters. There's a different rear yard setback for garages. Remember, in your municipality, the rear yard is the roadside. So it's a little bit different than, say, if you have a house in the city. And that's because in the lake community, the front yard and the is often the lakefront side. So you only have one row of houses. The houses are all lakefront properties. To keep things simple, we've just identified the front yard as the lakeside, the rear yard is the rear side. So it keeps it a little bit easier with the language. The rear yard setback for garages is often a little bit bigger than other buildings because of the size of them and because many folks will park a vehicle in front of the garage. So that's why that's a bit bigger, is to make room for parking of the vehicle in front of the garage. We've also indicated that accessory buildings will only be allowed on a property where there is an existing dwelling. For you guys, that's not a big deal, but I have seen over the last couple of years in particular, people with lake properties, they buy the lake property, the cottage on the property is not in great shape. And then they apply to tear down the cottage and build a garage package with living quarters on top. That would not be allowed with this land use bylaw. You would have to have a cottage on the property to be able to have a garage with a suite above. So that's sort of what we're getting at with those provisions. They would, again, be triggered by redevelopment, but it's trying to ensure and maintain that the character of your existing community stays the same moving forward. Who also wouldn't provide for a Quonset house. Those are something that we're seeing popping up in rural Alberta too. The next thing there is, we had a lot of long discussion with council about whether or not it made sense to identify a maximum number of accessory buildings on a lot, or if that should be left flexible and just addressed through the maximum lot coverage percentage for all buildings that's established in the land use bylaw. And ultimately where we landed is that council thought that it should be flexible, and that instead of identifying a maximum number of accessory buildings, it was more appropriate in your community to just limit the parcel coverage percentage. So how much of the surface of the lot could be covered in buildings. So that's the way that's been written right now. Boathouses. This is a picture of your community. And this is why we had to deal with boathouses. I'm not picking on anyone. But it is the reality, right? Is that the lake water level goes up and down in your community. And when it goes up, it is resulting in a situation where there are buildings in the lake. You can't put buildings in the lake. We have to be really careful about that. Some of the older buildings, though, from time to time or for a portion of the year are in the lake. And so moving forward, we need to set back new buildings so that we're not enabling this situation to occur. And that's to protect the lake, but it's also to protect your investment in any building that you're putting on your property. Is that we know better now. We know that this scenario can occur, and we know what the impacts are, and we know that the municipality actually doesn't have the authority to approve development in the bed and shore of a lake. That's provincial jurisdiction. And so we had to come up with something to minimize the potential for this to occur in the future. So there are regulations for boathouses that are different than other types of accessory buildings. A boathouse is one of the only types of an accessory building that's allowed in the lake side of your property. And we did that because in your community, there are a number of lots that have this very steep embankment and then this flat area at the bottom. And to require everybody to leave all of their watercraft and equipment associated with water activities at the top of the hill seemed not entirely reasonable, and a lot of work depending on the age and ability of the lot owner, and also challenging if you're dealing with kids, bringing them up and down already. It's hard to carry all of those things. So we tried to come up with a way of making sure that you could still use and enjoy your property in a reasonable way, but minimizing the impacts or the risk to development associated with being that close to a fluctuating high water level. So the way that it's written right now, we've clarified that you can have a boathouse, you can only have one, and that's to minimize risk to some extent too, and minimize impacts on the riparian area. You can't have sleeping accommodations in your boathouse. The intention of that building is to store watercraft and associated, equipment. So things you need near the water. And you have to make sure that it's set back above the 725.42 meter above sea level line. And that number is arrived at as a result of information from the province that dates back to the 80s and then has been revisited by the Watershed Council to try and identify what the high water mark is for the lake. So this is not the 1 in 100-year flood. There is still a possibility that water from time to time will go above 725, but this is the sort of negotiated, reasonable elevation line that development needs to be placed above in order to protect that development and to prevent this type of a situation or scenario from occurring moving forward for new development. My comments earlier about how, where these things exist today, the municipality, once this bylaw comes into effect, is not going to, go knocking on doors and ask people to remove these things. If there's any issue, it'll be with Alberta Environment. You might have already gotten those knocks. But this change to the land use bylaw would only be enforceable in the event that a new structure is being proposed. Okay. So the figure, I hope it provides some clarification about where the boathouse can be located, and it provides an example of where that would be in relation to the 725.42 meter mark. Other accessory uses that we know you have within your community and support and enjoy within your community are accessory dwelling units. The types of accessory dwelling units that you guys have are garage suites, guest house suites, secondary suites, bunk houses, and recreational vehicles. So we had a lot of discussion too around what was appropriate in your community. And our understanding through our discussions with council is that there are lots of properties that have at least one of these accessory dwelling units on the property. Many have two. And so we talked about appropriate numbers for these sorts of things, and where we're at right now is that the land use bylaw is written to allow a maximum of 2 accessory dwelling units on a lot, and it's up to you. You get to decide whether or not those 2 are, a garage suite and a guest house, 2 recreational vehicles, 2 bunk houses, a garage suite and a bunk house, a garage suite and a recreational vehicle. Each property owner can choose what's appropriate for you on your property, and then there is the flexibility there to accommodate that. But the desire here was to limit the potential offsite impacts from too much development on a lot. And one of the things that we also were looking at as we were going through this process was minimizing the amount of non-permeable surface on each of the lots to minimize the runoff from the lots going directly towards the lake, which we know can have a negative impact on the lake water quality too. So trying to balance out those considerations, we wanted to make sure that people could still continue to use and enjoy their properties with their friends and their extended family, and keep their RV on their property, but still try to minimize potential negative impacts on adjacent property owners and the lake itself. So review that section, flag that for you 9.3, and let us know what your thoughts are about that, if that's an appropriate number, if it's too high, if it's too low, any of those things. The next use that we wanted to highlight for you is bed and breakfast operations. And we had a conversation about bed and breakfast operations once we had a conversation about Airbnbs, and then we sort of went in a circle back and forth about those things. Because there is a relationship between the two. They're different uses, but they are related uses. Bed and breakfast operations are currently in your existing land use bylaw not a use that is regulated and allowed. The new land use bylaw would allow for the operation of a property as a bed and breakfast establishment. It has very clear parameters about the number of guests that could be in the house. When the bed and breakfast is operating, it requires that the operator also be in the house or cottage. So there's on-site monitoring of the situation. It has a requirement for the provision of sufficient on-site parking. It does not allow for signs or advertising, and it does not allow a bed and breakfast to be operated out of a recreational vehicle, bunkhouse, tent, or tented structure, or any other type of accessory building. So it has to be within the main building itself. The reason we sort of went with this, the council included provisions that would enable a bed and breakfast to operate, is that there are existing Airbnb or tourist accommodations within your municipality today. And when we went sort of searching for that, it was a bit of a surprise that there are existing Airbnbs, but they're everywhere. And we had a conversation about that and whether or not there were negative impacts on adjacent property owners or the Summer Village as a result of that operation. And because nobody seemed to know it was there, we didn't think that it had had a very significant negative impact on residents in the Summer Village. And so if an Airbnb could operate without an on-site security or monitoring person, then what would the harm be in allowing a bed and breakfast where there would be those additional protocols in place to ensure that there were not negative impacts? So that was, I'm just sort of giving you a bit of information about the thought process that we went through and arrived at to include this use. And this is another one that I'm sure council would appreciate your feedback about as well. So 9.4, have a look at that one. 9.6 talks about dwelling units on a lot, and the way that the land use bylaw is written today, and I think it's also intended to be in your existing land use bylaw, but I don't know it's quite as clear, is that it only allows for one single detached dwelling or modular home. So that's one that looks stick built once it lands on a lot. But we did revise this section to enable up to 2 accessory dwelling units that as I described on the last slide. So that would be guest house, garage, suite, RVs, in addition to the 1 single detached dwelling or modular home on the lot. So when you're thinking about the section that provides information about accessory dwelling units, think about this section too. It may seem like it's too restrictive to allow only 1 bunkhouse and 1 garage suite, or only 1 bunkhouse and 1 RV. But when you start thinking about it cumulatively on all of the lots and how many dwelling units that actually would enable on each lot within the municipality, which goes from 1 to 3, it is potentially quite a substantial increase in density within your community. So think about those things too, and you have to think about 9.6 in the same time as 9.3, because they really are related sections as well. All right, environmental protection, 9.7. So in this section, we have some provisions that would prohibit the permanent disturbance of water courses, wetlands, and water bodies. And you may think, other than the lake, that there aren't necessarily water courses or wetlands within your municipality, but there are. So here's a picture of a seasonal water course that runs through the north part of the Summer Village in one of the lots that's quite close to, or has a very similar elevation to the lake water level. And there is this water course that does exist there. It's in the provincial data, and you can see it from time to time. When we were out there a couple summers ago, there was water flowing freely through there. And you might have had a fair bit of that this year, I'm not sure, but I suspect you've seen a little bit more water. So we provided some clear regulations about how development can occur adjacent to these features. And we have stated quite clearly that going forward, new development will not be allowed that permanently disturbs permanent water courses, wetlands, or water bodies. We don't want our development to cause damage to these features that are really important, because they do have an impact on the lake, and also the water is going to go where the water wants to go. So if we don't start thinking about these things when we're thinking about the approval process, we could inadvertently be creating a lot of hardship and costs for a landowner or developer, because we didn't require them to set the development back when we knew chances were the site was not suitable for what's being proposed. The next thing here discourages shoreline modifications except for erosion protection, and then there's a prohibition against adding sand to the bed and shore of the lake or lands adjacent to the lake, and that's to protect that sensitive riparian area as well. 9.8 provides regulations that address erosion and sediment control, and this is because we know that it's important to minimize the amount of runoff entering the lake, so that we can try to reduce the amount of sediment and phosphorus and other contaminants that are entering the lake. Development is going to happen within the community, and this bylaw enables development, but it does try to minimize or mitigate those negative impacts from development that can happen during the construction process, during and after. So the provisions for an erosion and sediment control plan have been identified just to try to manage runoff. You guys may remember a few years ago when there was this gigantic plume near Seba Beach from a development that occurred in the county, I think without approvals. And it was just, the ground was cleared of the vegetation, and then a big rain came, and there was no plan for managing runoff on the site, and it was just like the perfect storm, right? And it resulted in this big plume of dirt and sediment entering the lake. So if we just think about these things prior to undertaking construction, it's not an expensive additional cost. It just requires a little bit more planning to make sure that if you dig your basement and then the rain comes, we've got, silt stopping mechanisms to prevent that dirt from running off of the site. So that's what we're thinking about. For fences and walls, James and I, in going through this and preparing for the presentation, noted that there was an error in this section. And the section that relates to development not requiring a permit. We have identified in the section that deals with development not requiring a permit fences that comply with section 9.9 of the land use bylaw. And then the first provision right now in section 9.9 of the land use bylaw says that all fences require a permit. So a little bit of a circular problem. We did talk about fences a fair bit with council, and I think I was supposed to pull that first provision from 9.1 and we just missed it. So council, unless you tell me not to, I'm going to remove that from 9.9. It's the 9.91, because I think that we made a mistake there and that we did not follow your direction. So I'll correct that in the next version. I just wanted to draw that to everybody's attention that we did make an oopsies. The new provisions establish a maximum height for fences that provides, I think, a little bit clearer guidance for how you deal with an undulating lot that has different topographic or contour changes. And then we've tried to provide diagrams to clarify where on a lot a fence can be built and where it cannot be built. So the requirements in the bylaw state that you can build a fence in your side yard adjacent to your house or cottage and in the roadside yard, the rear yard. New fences will not be allowed on the lakefront side. So I know some of you do have fences on the lakefront side. They're fine, they can remain. But moving forward, new fences won't be allowed on that side of the property. And part of that will be to ensure, unfettered access across the footpath easement area. And part of that also helps to ensure that, that wonderful park-like feel back there and beautiful views of the lake are maintained. There are many summer villages don't allow fences on the lakefront side of the lots for those reasons, specifically to maintain views. So that's some of the justification or reasoning behind why those provisions are added. Grading, stripping, and drainage. Development permit is required for stripping and or grading that would alter surface water drainage from the lot. So we talked a fair bit about this too. If you are a gardener with a beautiful garden and you bring in dirt from time to time for your garden, we're not worried about that. But if you are doing significant enough stripping and regrading of your property that it would alter the flow of water, of surface water, then you need a development permit. And there needs to be a conversation with the municipality just to make sure that once you're done your stripping and regrading, you haven't inadvertently drained your property into your neighbor's yard or drained your property in such a way that you could negatively impact slope stability on the embankment side, for those of you who are adjacent to an embankment. The native vegetation on your property provides a lot of assistance with maintaining the stability of those steep slopes. So it's worth having the conversation. There's some value in that for sure. Grading, stripping, excavation, and landscaping or planting is also identified as not permitted within the footpath easement without written consent from the Summer Village. So that would require development authority approval as well. So that's really the only place on the lot where the Summer Village has a whole lot of interest in your landscaping and planting. But if you're thinking about doing landscaping or planting within the footpath easement area, that requires a discussion with the Summer Village as well. The next section deals with home occupations. And so, over COVID, we've had to sort of think about our definitions for home occupations in a different way. We used to just define major home occupations and minor home occupations, and the difference between the two had to do with how many people were coming to a site, coming to the place of business a day. So we're trying to minimize or regulate offsite visitors, offsite employees. A major home occupation would allow for more offsite visitors or customers coming to the site, and a minor home occupation, generally it's undertaken by the person who lives in the house. They don't have additional staff or employees, and there's a very low number of customers that can come to the property over the course of a day in order to minimize impacts on the neighbors. So major home occupations aren't allowed in the land use bylaw as it's drafted, and minor home occupations would be provided for as long as a development permit was issued for them. Now, minor home occupations should be so inconsequential in terms of visits to the property that you wouldn't even know what was going on unless your neighbor told you. The other thing that we wanted to clarify too in this version is that a major or minor home occupation doesn't include remote work from home types of activities. So me doing this public open house, virtual open house from my home office tonight, that wouldn't be considered a minor home occupation. That's just working from home from time to time, as more and more people are doing these days. So there's a distinction in the land use bylaw between those three different types of work activities that can be proposed or occur within a house. All right, landscaping requirements. This is different for you guys, and this is something that we're looking at and seeing incorporated into Summer Village land use bylaws more and more over the last few years. And the purpose of this is to try and minimize impacts from development on the lake water quality. So this is the way we do it, really, is we try to encourage vegetation on a lot, specifically trees and shrubs and things with deep roots, and discourage too much of a lot from being covered in non-permeable surface, because the water runs off of that faster and it doesn't have the opportunity to filter before it enters the lake. The older land use bylaws don't have any provisions that address these things at all. The Summer Village, I can think of one or two maybe that do care about the appearance of your landscaping, but that isn't the intent here. It's not getting into the aesthetics at all. It's just trying to ensure that when a property is redeveloped, these things are taken into consideration. We worked on a number of land use bylaws down at Pigeon Lake, and this was one of the main changes to their land use bylaws, was starting to incorporate these types of design mitigations just to try and protect the lake water quality. So you guys have these two pretty distinctive types of lots within your municipality. We've identified them as R1, I believe we said R2, let me just check that. Yeah, R2 lots. And the distinction between them is the size of the lot, the depth of the lot, most specifically. On the R1 lots, which are the longer and often bigger lots, the following landscaping requirements have been proposed. So in terms of buildings, in our little chart there, we've said dwelling, but that would also include garages and other accessory buildings. James, that's maybe something we need to adjust in the chart in the bylaw. The percentage of the lot that can be covered in those buildings is 30%. That's the maximum. The other types of surfaces, so an asphalt driveway or non-permeable pavers, the percentage of the lot that can be covered in those types of surfaces, the maximum is 10%. And then the next one that's circled there, that should be 30% maximum, not minimum. There is a requirement moving forward when a lot is redeveloped for 30% of the lot to be covered in, oh, sorry, it is supposed to be minimum, you made that adjustment. A minimum of 30% of the lot to be covered in vegetation, including trees and shrubs. Sorry, James, thanks for stepping in there. In the land use bylaw right now, the wording in the chart says 30% maximum. We've corrected it here on the slide, but we'll have to make that adjustment in the draft. And then that leaves another 30% of the lot as a kind of flex area. Flex area is intended to be places on the lot where soft landscaping elements and permeable surfaces, so things like gravel, rock gardens, other landscaping, would be encouraged. So if you want that to be vegetation, trees and shrubs, that's fine. But if your landscaping plan for your property includes some soft landscaping elements, there's provisions here too to allow for that. And really what we're trying to do is just minimize the amount of non-permeable surface and ensure that the vegetation that's on those really environmentally significant lakefront lots includes not just grass, it also has to include vegetation that has a deeper root structure to protect the lake water quality. And that's the only reason that the municipality cares at all, is that they're the only folks really who have the ability to try and ensure that there are design mitigations on these lots directly adjacent to the lake that are implemented at time of redevelopment. So it doesn't affect you today unless you're proposing to substantially redevelop your lot. What you've got on your lot is fine, but when you go to redevelop, these things would come into effect. So on the R2 lots, which are a little bit smaller, the percentages are a little bit different, and they're a little bit different just to reflect that the lot itself is smaller. So they wouldn't be achievable at the same percentages on the R2 lots. So the R1 lot allows for 20% maximum coverage for dwelling. The R2 lot allows for 40%, and it's just because the lots themselves are a little bit smaller, and we had to make sure that it would fit. And when we were coming up with the percentages, we looked at the size of the lots within your municipality, and then we looked at the average area of the existing dwellings or cottages on the lots to make sure that this was reasonably achievable within your existing built footprint, and it is. So they're not arbitrarily chosen numbers. We looked at your existing lot sizes, we looked at your existing built footprint on your lot, and then we're trying to sort of keep that moving forward. So that should help to maintain your existing character, and then put some parameters in place to minimize negative impacts with redevelopment. And I don't know within your community specifically, I don't think you've had the same rate of redevelopment as some of the other summer villages throughout the province, but for the most part, probably you will agree that when redevelopment occurs on a lot, what goes in is not the same size as what was once there. When we're redeveloping our lakefront lots, the structures that are going in are, for the most part, substantially larger. So we don't set some upper threshold parameters. There is the ability or the possibility that we could have problems, and they'll impact the entire lake, and then they'll impact everybody on the lake. So that's where the motivation is for these changes. And hopefully I've provided some information to assist you to understand what the triggers would be for when this stuff would come into effect. So pools and hot tubs. Hot tubs are one of those accessory buildings that are the exception to the rule for what makes sense to have in the lakeside of a lot. We're sort of thinking about where people put their hot tubs, and you know, just if you're thinking about your neighbors or where your hot tub is, I can't imagine that there's a whole lot of them that are on the roadside. You've got your hot tub, you want it where the beautiful view is. So they are one of those exceptions. They're a type of accessory building that's allowed on the lakeside of the lot. They do require a development permit. So we want to think about where the water is going when it leaves the hot tub. They may be allowed in any yard, front or rear. The only place that they're not allowed is below that 725.42 above sea level line mark. That's because that's a place on the lot that we anticipate will be inundated with water from time to time. They're also not allowed within 6 meters of the front property line. So that's too close to the lake, or within the footpath easement. So your hot tub can't obstruct the footpath easement. Recreational vehicles. There's some parameters now around recreational vehicles. What we're trying to do with those provisions too is just to make sure that when there's an RV on a lot, it's it's parked in a location that isn't going to have a negative impact on your neighbors. So there's a requirement for a parking stall for the RV. We don't care which RV is in it. We do care though about where the RV or RVs, if they have different ones coming and going, are going to be located on your lot, just to make sure there's enough room and that it's not too close to your neighbors. It's not in the road. That happens from time to time. There's a maximum of 2 RVs that are identified as allowed on a lot. RVs kept on a permanent or quasi-permanent basis have to be on a constructed pad rather than in a yard, so sort of on the grass. And they're not to be used as a primary dwelling, so not the place that you are residing in when you're at the lake all of the time. And then the last regulation there that's been identified is that the use of generators are prohibited as the RV source of power, and that's just to manage noise associated with the RV. So have a look at that section too. Think about how you utilize your lot in relation to RVs and who comes and goes and those sorts of things, and provide us with some input about recreational vehicles, whether or not this will work for you. All right, retaining walls. We have some provisions around how retaining walls are to be developed. They are surprisingly problematic. We don't have a little bit of information about them. Because they do impact how drainage occurs, and they can impact privacy on a lot too. Retaining walls have to conform to building and safety code requirements. If they're above the height that would require an engineered design, they need to be engineered so that we know that they're not going to create issues. And we've established some parameters around when a development permit will be required for them and when they will not. CCANs, these are really popular right now, CCANs. So many land use bylaws, I think actually all of the ones that we work with about 78 different municipalities. So anyone who's revised their land use bylaw in the last 15 years has dealt with CCANs as a special type of accessory building. We've said that the placement of a CCAN in the Summer Village would require a development permit. And if a CCAN is coming in, it has to conform aesthetically to the buildings on adjacent properties. So not just your property, but you have to sort of match what your neighbors have got going on. So it doesn't really look like a CCAN when you're done with it at the end of the day. And there's a maximum of 1 CCAN that's permitted on a lot. In terms of the recreational vehicles, permanent or quasi-permanent will be something that's there year round or, an entire season. So if it's going to be there, if it's not coming and going every weekend, that would probably be permanent or quasi-permanent. We can look at adding a definition for that to provide greater clarification. I don't think there is one right now, so that's a good question. Site conditions. So you guys are at the lake. The lake is incredible. It's really beautiful. It is also a place where there's lots and lots of development hazards. That's what makes it so beautiful to some extent. So there's areas within your community where we have the steep embankment with slopes that are steeper than 15%, which is where we start to worry about slumpage or slope instability. You have had over the last 5 years situations where the slope has moved on some lots, and then you have other parts of your community where the lake water level and the ground are almost exactly the same. And the groundwater table is phenomenally high, probably because at one point pieces of the Summer Village were part of the lake. So we have to think about when redevelopment occurs, what the characteristics of the lot are to make sure that the municipality isn't approving something on a piece of property that is just not appropriate on that piece of property, and because of the hazards on the property, could be damaged, as a result of the slope moving or high water table during a flood event. So municipalities could always ask for additional engineering information to be provided. It's a little bit easier to do it if you have clear parameters or qualifiers, I guess, for when additional requirements will be asked for. I think it's also a little bit more fair for you within the community to be able to look to the land use bylaw and say, okay, you're asking me to have a geotechnical report accompany my development permit application because my site exhibits X, Y, or Z. Now I understand, right? Rather than why me and not my neighbor. So we've tried to provide a little bit of additional clarification about, what the triggers would be for asking for this additional supporting information and explain why to some extent, right? So the pictures on this slide are all pictures from your community and situations that have occurred, over the last 10 years. But we have to be mindful of the fact that, in these really phenomenal places like the Summer Villages, we have to manage risk. We have to manage risk for you, the landowner, and we have to manage risk for the municipality. If the municipality approves something in a location where they ought not to have, the municipality could be responsible for costs associated with problems with that development moving forward. So we're protecting everybody by ensuring that sufficient information is being provided to the development authority to determine the suitability of the site prior to issuing the permit. This is just that 725.42 mark that I mentioned before. The Summer Village, one of the other things that Tim didn't mention is he was going through some of the work that the Summer Village has undertaken over the last few years. There was an engineering surveying company provided information about very detailed contours within the municipality so that we were able to establish in the mapping the location of the 725.42 meter above seawater or sea level mark on the mapping. It's pretty accurate. It's, if you are doing development on your lot, you may want your surveyor to confirm exactly where that is if what you're proposing is close to that mark. But it does give you a pretty good visual representation of where that line is on your property and which portion of your lot would be unsuitable for additional development to occur on. So that's what we're trying to do with this information is make it a little bit easier for community members to see where or what portions of their properties are too close to the water, are too low to facilitate additional development. And it does not mean, that you may not want to have this site verified for your lot if you're redeveloping in that location, but it does give you an idea of whether or not there is a red flag in that location and whether you may want to get additional information just to make sure that what you're proposing is okay in that spot. In identifying the 725.42 meter mark, we have also included a regulation that says, or restriction, single detached dwellings, boathouses, garage suites, guest house suites, and all other accessory buildings will not be allowed below that mark. So it is a significant change from what was in the document before, but it's intended to protect property owners within the Summer Village, and then to protect the Summer Village from approving something that they ought not to have, that ends up, in the lake, and then the municipality ends up responsible for approving something that they should not have too. So. All right, there is an exception. So this is a blow up of map 2 in the land use bylaw. At the south end of the Summer Village, where there is the steeper embankment, you can see that the 725.42 meter mark is really close to the west side of the west parcel boundary of the lots. As you move further north, where those lots are much closer, where the land is much closer to the water, the 725.42 moves up into a couple of those lots. So we had to think about how to deal with this in a way that would be fair for those property owners that have, a large portion of their lot currently below 725.42. And the solution proposed is this notwithstanding clause. So the notwithstanding clause says, notwithstanding other provision in the bylaw, all development regulations affecting parcels in the R2 residential, so that shallow lot district, with greater than 50% of the lot located below the 725.42 meter above sea level elevation, shall be at the discretion of the development officer, who shall require that the proposed development be designed to incorporate appropriate geotechnical and floodproofing measures to the satisfaction of the Summer Village's engineer. So the only folks who can do development below 725.42 are the folks who could not reasonably develop their lot at all if they weren't allowed this exception. So that's why this has been included. It's to accommodate the people whose lots are really, really close to where the high level water of the lake is, that 725.42. So if you are one of those property owners and you have questions about this, I want to encourage you to reach out to us and we can have some further discussion about this. But the exception was very deliberate, and it was intended to ensure that, you know, those few properties, and I think there's 2, maybe 3, we're not going to be in a situation where the lots could not possibly be redeveloped in the future. This doesn't mean that they would be necessarily really easy to redevelop, because they would require mitigations, but it does enable them to be redeveloped going forward. So it was important for us to flag this for you as well. Tourist homes. Tourist homes, we now have a definition for, so that's our Airbnbs or VRBO situations. They are enabled. You do have at least one today operating. I'll let you guess where that is. These provisions would enable a tourist home with a development permit. It is a change of use. It should have a permit. There are specific development permit application requirements identified in the section. They are prohibited within recreational vehicles, bunkhouses, tents, tented structures, or accessory buildings without cooking or bathroom facilities. So if you had a guest house with the kitchen and a bedroom and a bathroom, or a garage suite with those facilities, you could Airbnb that guest house or a garage suite, but you couldn't Airbnb a bunkhouse, right? So something that didn't have appropriate kitchen and bathroom facilities. So look at this, and you need to let us and council know what your thoughts are about this, because this is different than today. Today, I would suggest that tourist homes, Airbnbs, VRBOs are not allowed. Your land use bylaw does not have a definition for them, but it also does not allow other types of commercial developments, which this is. And the absence of a defined use class for this type of use is not justification, or you can't assume that because it's not defined, it is allowed. It isn't allowed. It's not regulated, but it isn't allowed today. So this is a change. The provisions limit the number of occupants, so it couldn't be, 18 bachelorettes in the property, or bachelors. It's limited to 6 short-term occupants, doesn't include the kids. And they're not allowed to have signs advertising the rental of it. So it shouldn't change the appearance from the road of the property. So let us know what your thoughts are. We're almost through, you guys. Tree removal. Tree removal that would result in less than 10% of the total area of the lot being covered in tree canopy requires a development permit. So if you're taking down a tree because you need to take down the tree, so it's going to fall on your cottage or your house, or it's going to fall on your neighbor's fence or something like that, the municipality doesn't want a development permit. But if you're clearing a substantial number of trees, so substantial that less than 10% of the total area of your lot would be covered in tree canopy, then the municipality would like you to have a development permit. Because that is a substantial landscaping change. And then the new provisions that relate to landscaping, they would apply. This bylaw also establishes replacement requirements for the removal of mature trees. And that's because we can't have provisions that require a certain amount of a lot to be covered in vegetation and trees without then ensuring that if a tree comes down, the tree goes up to replace it. So the last bit in the land use bylaw that I wanted to discuss with you are the districts themselves. And there are 3 districts in the draft land use bylaw. There's the sort of pinky colored area, which is the R1 district. The yellow area is the R2 district. It's our shallow lot district. So those you can see, they're aptly described. And then the 3rd district is a natural environment reserve district. When you're looking at this, or if you've ever looked at the existing land use bylaw map, you'll notice in the green area, it looks like there's a whole bunch of additional lots. And it is true, those lots are registered. They do have titles, but that area is not developed. Most of the land within that green area is crown land or public land, or in some kind of an ownership situation like that. The land that is directly adjacent to the roads is municipal land. Those are reserve lands that are owned by the municipality. But the ones that look like individual subdivided lots, those are mostly Crown and public lands. Some of them do have individual titles, but they don't appear to be owned by individual landowners. So the existing use of that property is green space for the most part, and the proposed district that would apply to that just perpetuates the continued use of that property as being the same as it is today. We did change the uses that are identified in the two residential districts. The wording changed to reflect the different defined terms in the land use bylaw. And then things that hadn't been defined and contemplated in the bylaw before that now are, like boathouses or sea cans or solar energy collection systems. It just means your solar panels. Those sorts of things are identified as permitted or discretionary uses within the districts. Before, they would have all been sort of they would have fallen into the accessory building or accessory use category, but some of these now have special provisions that apply to them that allows the municipality to regulate them in a slightly different way than other types of accessory buildings or uses. And so we've identified them specifically in the districts as well. So the land use bylaw only has the two maps. It has the land use district map with the 3 districts, and then it has the map, supporting map that identifies the 725.42 meter above sea level line, so that you can see where that is. In the electronic version of the document, you can blow that up pretty well. It gives you a pretty good look at where that is on the property, if you're interested in having a peek at that. Or if you have any specific questions about it as it pertains to your lot, James and I can chat with you about that too, and we might be able to provide you with a better, closer up image that would give you a closer look at that for your property too. So there you go. That's an entire land use bylaw in a lot, well, more time than I had intended to talk, but it's a lot to cover. So I appreciate all of you who hung on to the bitter end. The next steps for the project will be for us again to encourage you to read through the document. And contact us with your comments and any questions that you might have. We're asking you to please reach out to us with your comments and feedback before August 7th so that we can keep this moving along for council and for you. Once we have that feedback, we'll provide a summary of it and some recommendations for council's consideration in a What We Heard report that will go to council, a regular council meeting, and be posted on the Summer Village's website. If there are things in the document that are very alarming to you and you want to make sure that you're at the next meeting of council where they're thinking about some of these things, just reach out to us and we'll make sure that you're aware of when that is. Council's been very clear that it's important that we have as much community involvement in this as we can get. So you just reach out and we'll make sure that we're sharing information with you and you know where and when the next steps are occurring so that you can be involved in those things too. Once council's considered the feedback from the community on the draft and directed us to make any additional changes, and we make some changes too, just based on the little oopsies that I identified today. I'm sure there's going to be a few more typographical things that we have to address. We will update the land use bylaw and get it ready for consideration of first reading. After first reading, the Summer Village will hold the public hearing. Notice will be provided to everybody in the community. If the change is made to the document before first reading, do not address the things that you had concerns about. Make sure that you come to that public hearing. The public hearing is your opportunity to give your testimony to council directly, so to tell them what you think, to suggest changes to the document or to indicate your support of provisions in the document. After the public hearing, council will carefully consider the information provided at that time. They can, after the public hearing, and often councils do direct some additional changes pertaining to matters that arose at the public hearing. So we can revise the land use bylaw with council's direction to reflect feedback from the public hearing, but we'll be getting the document updated based on that direction from council for their consideration of second and third readings. So we're in a place right now where the document can be changed. quite easily, right? Just let council know your questions, concerns, and council will direct us to do what they deem appropriate. After the bylaw is given first reading, any changes to the bylaw have to be done by amending motion. After the public hearing, we can only make changes to the document based on the input from the public hearing. So the earlier we get your input, the easier it is to make sure that it is incorporated into the document. So my plea to you is, I know that it's summer and we only get so many glorious days, but if you can have a look at the document and provide us with your comments by August 7th, that's better for us, because we can make sure that we're at the right point in the process to be able to incorporate those changes. So that's my ask, I guess, is have a look at this. I hope that this information will help you as you go through your review to just direct you to some of those sections that you may have strong feelings about, they may impact you, so that you can have a look at it and we can have some further dialogue. That is it. That is the end of my talking at you. James, were there any questions in the chat that you wanted to raise or were unable to address, or that we should have some discussion about?
No, either nobody wanted to talk to me, or they were so wrapped up in your presentation that they didn't share any questions other than Robert's. There was one brief comment from Tim, just to make sure that there's clarity that only one garage suite, secondary suite, or guest suite would be allowed on a lot, and then one other of either a RV or a bunkhouse, or only 2 RVs or 2 bunkhouses. Just there is a lot of numbers being thrown around there during the presentation. So just to clarify that only one garage suite, garden suite, or secondary suite is allowed per lot.
Thank you, and thanks for pointing that out, Tim. I misspoke. I didn't represent that properly. You're right. You're right. Are there any? Did anyone else have any comments or questions? I know I gave you a lot of information tonight. It's probably a lot to digest. If you don't, it's okay. I told you I wouldn't put you in the hot seat tonight, but we would like to encourage you to reach out to us over the next couple of weeks, and we'd be happy to have some additional conversation with you for sure. Okay.
I'm just very briefly, I'm going to allow everybody to unmute, just in case anybody is having trouble with the chat function. So hopefully not everybody unmutes and starts yelling, but I am going to allow everyone to unmute themselves if they want to do so and ask a question that they couldn't put into the chat.
You won't turn on all of your videos all at once, just in case I put you to sleep. You're safe. Okay. Well, then I encourage you to go have a nightcap and have a lovely, lovely evening. Tim, is there anything that you wanted to say before we shut this down?
No, I just wanted to thank everybody once again for participating. I know it's a lot of information to digest in a short period of time, but please take the opportunity to read and reach out to MPS or counselors if you have questions. And maybe one last plea, if there's any questions tonight, I'd love to hear them.
I don't know if you can hear me. It's Denny Thomas.
Yes.
It was just a question about, I mean, I have a number of, because I was one of the drafters of the original bylaw, there's some legal issues that are lurking there that I'll put in writing, you know, that I think can be straightened out before the bylaw is finished. But I did have one question, and that's around creating non-conforming buildings. And I noticed the side yard setback has been changed from 0.6 meter to 1.4 meters. So it went from a 24-inch or 2-foot setback to almost a 56 inches or almost 5-foot side yard setback. I can say when we did the bylaw, but it was actually in the 1980s, we were very careful not to create non-conforming buildings. And is there a reason why that side yard setback got modified? Because I think you're going to find, if there's been an assessment, that there may be a significant number of accessory buildings that are intruding into a side yard that's 56 inches or 1.4 meters.
We can have a look at that, Denny. Normally we're pretty careful about not playing with those numbers either. One of the things that's come up in the last, I don't know, 10 years when we're looking at land use bylaws is the different ways that people are using accessory buildings, and trying to ensure that the setbacks are appropriate when the accessory building has a living accommodation in it. So you guys are allowing guest houses and garage suites, and we were thinking about the guest houses and garage suites when we were thinking about these setback numbers from the side yard too. You know, if it were just a regular shed, 0.6 meters or 1.4 meters, we probably don't care one way or another, but you're allowing a greater range or more flexibility in the way that those accessory buildings are used too. So we could revisit that, I think, and maybe have a distinction between like a garage suite guest house setback, where there is that accommodation piece that changes the code requirements, and other types of accessory buildings. That might be a better way to approach it.
Yeah, I think where you're going to find it occurs the most is actually in respect to boathouses, because nobody knew where the lot lines were 100 years ago when they built those. Many of the boathouses are, getting to be 90 to 100 years, 100 years old. And those are the ones that, in fact, they probably go right across the lot lines. But in other cases, they're very, very close to the property lines. So anyway, I just thought I'd flag that one because, again, we were really careful 40 years ago when we were doing this to make sure that we didn't create non-conforming buildings.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. And it's when we're working with a town or a village or something like that, we tend to be really careful with that too. And we were certainly mindful of it as we were going through this process, but we were trying to figure out how to deal with the guest houses and the garage suites.
Yeah, and actually, that's a good point. That's really where you want the separation more than these sort of minor accessory building.
Yeah, for sure. So I'll flag that for council too, and we can maybe have a distinction between those. I don't think that would be harmful. It might address that issue.
Yeah, and I'll write a letter or an email in respect to the footpath easement definition and some other, and actually the bed and shore, because this Kapasiwin is unique. The west lot lines are actually extend out into the lake. So the village boundary is actually in the lake in many cases. It's because it was a road allowance that got closed and then incorporated in a replot. So it's, I think it's important that gets sorted out because the little sketch plan is not accurate. It doesn't actually reflect the legal reality for most of the lots, particularly in Zone R1.
Okay, yeah, looking forward to seeing that. You were very insightful with the MDP process too, so thank you, Denny.
Yeah. Okay.
All right, and anybody else before we shut this down this evening? Okay, well, thank you so much, everybody. We kept you here for a long time this evening. I really appreciate your time, and we're looking forward to hearing your comments as we move through this next stage of the process. So I hope you all have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.